That's what she went for. Less than a good saddle blanket. Less than the whiskey the men who bid on her drank that same afternoon while they laughed about it. I know the number because I'm the one who wrote it down. I lettered the notice that brought them all out, nailed it to the freight office wall with my own hammer in my own hand, and got paid a paper sack of horseshoe nails for the trouble. I've mended a lot of broken things in my life. Harness, hinges, fence wire, men's saddles, and once or twice men, but I've never figured out how to mend that afternoon. What I want to tell you about isn't the auction. Auctions were common enough out there, if you called them the right thing and used the right paper, and everybody in Cordero Wash was awful good at calling things the right thing. What I want to tell you about is what the cowboy did after. Because he paid the $2. He paid it in front of everybody, and every man there thought they knew exactly what kind of man that made him. They were wrong. God help them, they were so wrong that some of them never got over being wrong, and one of them died of it. Stay with me. This one takes a while to get where it's going, and where it's going isn't where you think. The price. The rain had quit an hour before, which was the worst possible thing it could have done. If it had kept on, folks would have gone home. Rain in the Arizona territory in October is a rumor that comes true about twice, and when it comes true, everybody stands under an awning and watches it like it's opera. But it quit. It quit and left the whole street steaming and the smell of wet creosote hanging over everything, sweet and sharp, the way it does. And there was nothing else to do in Cordero Wash that Saturday, so they came. 40 men, maybe. A few women at the far edge, arms folded, faces set like they were attending something educational. And her on the loading dock behind the freight office, standing. That's the part I need you to hold on to. Standing. Not sitting, not slumped, not curled up the way you'd expect a person to be after what she'd been through. Standing with her back straight enough to lay a level on and her chin at an angle that would have got a white woman called uppity and got an Apache woman called dangerous. Her feet were bare. Somebody had taken her moccasins. I remember that better than I remember most of my own life. Bare feet on wet planking, and her toes gripping the wood a little, the way you grip when you're cold and won't say so. Purcell was doing the talking. Of course he was. Now I want it understood, Purcell said, hooking his thumbs in his vest like a man running for office. This here is a contract of service. Legal. Duly witnessed. She's got no people, no place, and under the vagrancy statute she's subject to being bound out to a responsible party for a term. Somebody in the back said, "How long a term?" "Term of usefulness," Purcell said, and got his laugh. I want to be honest with you about myself here, because if I'm not honest at the start, you've got no reason to believe me later. I did not shout. I did not step up on that dock. I stood in the crowd with a broken hame strap in my hands. I'd been mending it when the noise started and just carried it out with me, the way I carry things. And I worked that strap through my fingers over and over like a man saying his beads, and I said not one word. 31 years old, 2 good hands, a voice that worked fine. Nothing. The bidding started at 4 bits. 4 bits from a hand off the Delaney outfit who was drunk and thought it was funny. $1 from a man I won't name because his grandchildren still live there. $1.25. $1.50. It went slow and stupid, the way a thing goes when nobody actually wants it and everybody wants to be seen not wanting it in the right way. Men were bidding on a joke. They were bidding on the story they'd tell at supper. And Purcell was getting angry, which I didn't understand until later. See, Purcell had brought her in expecting a different arithmetic. There'd been money in the territory for Apache. Not officially, not by then, not in any statute you could point at, but there were arrangements, and there were men who'd made a living off arrangements. Purcell had ridden south after some of that money and come back with 1 live woman and a lame horse and a debt at the mercantile. And now he was standing on a loading dock trying to convert a human being into groceries, and it wasn't converting. $1.50, Purcell said. $50 gentleman for a woman who can cook, haul, sew, and mind stock. I've seen her work. She's got a back on her like a mule. Nobody said anything. Somebody's spurs chinked. I looked at her then. Really looked for the first time instead of looking at everybody looking at her. She was maybe 25, maybe 35. I was no judge. Her hair was cut short and ragged and uneven, and I knew enough by then to know that meant mourning, that she'd cut it herself for somebody, and nobody in that crowd knew who, and nobody was going to ask. She had a man's canvas shirt on, way too big, and a skirt of trade cloth, and around her neck a piece of rawhide string with one brass button on it. Just the one. A military button, tarnished green in the letters. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking out over our heads, at the water tank at the end of the street, with an expression I've spent 40 years trying to name, and the closest I've ever come is the way you look at a fly on the wall of a room you're never going to leave. Then Hollis Teague said, $2. He said it flat. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He was standing off to the left of the crowd with his hat off, the only man there with his hat off. And I noticed it then, and I've never stopped noticing it, and he said, $2, the way you tell a man the time. Everything went quiet in the particular way. Things go quiet when the joke stops being a joke. Because Hollis Teague was not funny. Hollis Teague was a top hand at the crossgay, 38 or 40 years old, 6 foot of gristle and sunburn, a man who had exactly one friend in that county, and it was a horse. He didn't drink with them. Didn't play cards with them. He came to town for coffee, baling wire, and quiet in that order, and he had a way of looking at a man that made the man remember he had somewhere to be. Somebody snickered anyway. Somebody always does. Well now, Purcell said, delighted, relieved, ugly with relief. $2 from Mr. Teague. Do I hear? He didn't, of course he didn't. Not one man in that crowd was going to bid against Hollis Teague for a woman, because then Hollis Teague would want to know why, and none of them wanted to explain themselves to Hollis Teague on a wet Saturday. Sold, Purcell said, $2 and cheap at twice the price. And Hollis Teague walked up onto that dock in front of 40 men and took $2 silver out of his shirt pocket. He'd had them ready. I saw that. He'd come with them ready, which means he'd known before he ever got there what he was going to do, and he set them in Purcell's palm. Then he did the thing. He turned to her, and he put his hat back on, and then he took it off again, and he said, and I was close enough to hear it, 12 feet, I'd swear to it in any court, he said, "Ma'am, my name's Hollis Teague. I've got a wagon at the end of the street, and I would be obliged if you'd ride in it, but I'm not going to make you." Ma'am. I heard the word land in that crowd like a rock in a rain barrel. She didn't move for a long moment. She looked at him, first time she'd looked at anybody, and I watched her go over him the way you'd go over a horse you were being offered too cheap. Boots, hands, eyes, hands again. Then she stepped down off that dock, past him, and started walking toward the end of the street on her bare feet through the mud. Not to the wagon, just walking head up. And Hollis Teague, 40 years old, top hand, 6 foot of gristle, put his hat on and walked behind her at a distance of about 10 feet, carrying nothing, saying nothing, like a man escorting a bride down an aisle nobody had built yet. I stood in the mud with a broken hame strap in my hands, and I felt something turn over in my chest that has never turned back. Here's what I did after. I went home and I mended the strap. That's my whole quirk, if you want to call it that, and I've been told it's a sickness, and I don't much argue. Give me a thing that's broken and I'm easy. Give me a thing that's wrong and I don't know where to put my hands. So I sat in my shop with the door open and the smell of wet dust coming in, and I punched new holes and set new rivets and hummed. Badly. I've been informed by every living soul who's ever heard me, my mother included, and I told myself a number of comfortable things. That it was a legal contract. That it was better than what Purcell had in mind. That somebody else would have bid if Teague hadn't, and that somebody would have been worse. And therefore what happened was in some roundabout way good, and therefore I had witnessed a good thing, and therefore the sick feeling in my gut was just bad coffee. Around dusk, Holly's Teague walked into my shop. I dropped a rivet, went down on my knees for it just to have something to do with my face. "Ward," he said. He never called anybody by their first name. I'm not sure he knew mine. "Teague, you do boots." "I do harness, Rays does boots." Rays wouldn't measure her. I came up off my knees slow. He was standing in my doorway with the last of the light behind him, and I couldn't see his face, and I don't believe that was an accident. "He wouldn't measure her," Teague said again in exactly the same voice, like maybe I hadn't understood the words. "Said his shop was full. It was empty. I stood in it. It was empty." I wiped my hands on my apron for about 9 seconds longer than my hands needed wiping. "She's outside." "In the wagon, she won't come in a building." He paused. "I don't blame her." So I went out. She was sitting in the bed of that wagon with her legs folded under her, and she'd found a horse blanket somewhere and had it around her shoulders, and she watched me come with a stillness that I want you to understand was not calm. There's a stillness that's calm and there's a stillness that's a cocked hammer. This was the second one. I stopped a good ways off. "Ma'am," I said, and felt like an idiot, and then thought, no. He said it and it didn't sound like an idiot. Try again. "Ma'am, my name's Tom Ward. I fix things. He's asking me to make you some boots, and I'm no good at boots, but I'm better than nothing, and I'd need to know how long your foot is." "Nothing." "I don't need to touch you," I said. "I've got a string. You put your foot on the string." "I don't come nearer than I am right now." Her eyes went a Teague, just a flick. He was standing about 15 feet off with his back half turned, looking at nothing, at the darkening street, giving her the whole entire world to decide in. She put her foot out over the tailgate. I laid the string down on the wagon boards and backed off, and she set her heel on one end of it, and I could see the sole of her foot in the last of the light. Cracked white lines across the bottom, blood dried black in the deepest one, the foot of somebody who had walked a very long way over things that hurt and hadn't been able to stop walking. She pinched the string at her toe, held it up, let it fall. I picked it up, 9 3/8. "Thank you," I said. And she said something. 2 syllables, low, in a language I didn't have. I looked at Teague. Teague shrugged one shoulder about a half-inch, which for him was a whole speech. I found out 3 weeks later what she'd said. I'll tell you when I get there. They wouldn't have her at the hotel. I don't mean Coyle refused. Coyle would have taken a Gila monster's money if the monster had money. What happened was Coyle came out onto his porch and said, "Teague, I got no rooms." And there were 11 rooms and 1 drummer from St. Louis in the whole building. And Coyle knew it and Teague knew it, and Coyle's wife was in the window with her hand over her mouth. And there wasn't anything to argue about, because nobody had said anything arguable. That's how it worked. Nobody ever said the thing. They said, "I got no rooms." Teague looked at him for a while. Then he said, "All right," and turned the team, and I heard the wheels going down toward the livery, and I stood in my doorway in the dark and listened to it and did nothing, which by then I was getting to be world-class at. They slept in the livery, both of them. He put her in the tack room with the door barred from the inside so she could bar it against him, which I want you to sit with for a second. He showed her the bar and put her hand on it, and then he went and slept in the aisle out front on the dirt with his saddle for a pillow and his rifle across his chest, facing the street. Facing the street. He wasn't guarding her from getting out. Old Mendez ran the livery, and Mendez told me all this the next morning while I was buying nails I didn't need just to hear about it, and Mendez was shook. Mendez had seen 30 years of that town. He kept saying, "No entiendo, no entiendo," and finally he said in English, "He does not touch her. He does not speak. He sleep in the dirt like a dog, and he, Tamaz, he asked her permission to feed the horses." "He what?" "They are his horses." Mendez threw his hands up. She is in the room with the horses. He knock on the door, he say, "May I come in and feed my horses, ma'am?" And he waits. I put down the nails, and I went and sat on a barrel behind my shop for about an hour. Because here's the thing that was eating me, and I might as well say it plain. I had told myself that what Teague did on that dock was decent. I had needed it to be decent, because if it was decent, then me standing in the crowd was just bad luck, bad timing, a man who didn't get to be the hero but was on the hero's side. There's a comfort in that. It's a lie shaped like a comfort. But it wasn't decent. That's what I couldn't get around. It wasn't decent because he paid. He stood there and he paid $2 for a human being in front of 40 witnesses and a legal contract, and no amount of hat in hand and ma'am and sleeping in the dirt changes the arithmetic of that. He bought her. He knew he'd bought her. And I came to understand later, much later, in a way I'll get to, that he knew it better than anybody, and that it sat on him like a stone, and that he'd made a decision on that dock that most men would spend a lifetime avoiding. He could have stood in the crowd like me, clean hands, nothing on his conscience but the whole thing. Instead, he put his hands in it. Some choices don't have a clean side. Some choices only have a side you can live with and a side you can't, and the one you can live with still costs you something you don't get back. The boots took me 4 days. They were bad boots. I want that on the record. I'm a harness man. I made her a pair of ankle boots off a pattern I traced from a catalog with a bootjack shape I didn't understand, and the left one had a seam in a place a seam has no business being, and I knew it when I stitched it, and I stitched it anyway because I couldn't figure out how to fix it. But I lined them. That's the one thing I did right. I took a piece of blanket wool, good wool, the piece I'd been saving for a saddle skirt for a customer who was never going to pay me anyway, and I lined the hole inside of both boots so they'd be soft on those cracked white lines. Teague came in on Wednesday to get them. He had dust to his knees. He'd ridden in from the Crossgay, 22 miles, for a pair of boots. He looked at them a long time, turned them over. Found the bad seam immediately. Of course he did. He'd been in leather his whole life and rubbed his thumb across it. "How much?" he said. "Nothing." He set the boots down on my bench. "How much, Ward?" "Teague." "I'm not going to take a gift for her from a man who stood in that crowd," he said. And he said it without heat. That's what makes it the worst thing anybody has ever said to me. There was no heat in it at all. He might have been telling me the weather. He wasn't insulting me. He was just correcting the record, putting the ledger straight. I stood there in my own shop and felt about 2 inches tall and 30 years old and useless. $4, I said. Something moved across his face. "4, he said. "That's the price." He counted it out. 4 silver dollars on my bench, and neither one of us said the obvious thing, and both of us heard it anyway, loud as a church bell in that little room, twice what she was worth to the world. He picked up the boots and went to the door and stopped. "Ward." "Yeah." "She's got a name," he said. "It ain't $2. That's what they're calling her at the Rialto. I hear it again in this town. I'm going to have to do something about it, and I don't want to." "What is it?" I said. "Her name." He stood in my doorway with the light coming in around him, and he was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "She hasn't given it to me. It's hers to give." And he walked out into the street. 3 weeks, that's what we got. 3 weeks of the Crossgay wagon coming in on Saturdays and her sitting in the bed of it in my bad boots, back straight, watching that water tank, while Teague did his business at the Mercantile and half the town found urgent reasons to walk past. 3 weeks of Mendez telling me things. That she'd started walking the fence line in the evenings, alone, and Teague never followed, and every evening she came back, and Mendez said Teague never once looked up when she went out but never once slept until she'd come back in. That she'd fixed the tack room door. Not barred it, fixed it. The hinge had been dragging for 2 years, and Mendez came in one morning, and it swung sweet as a whisper, and there were shims cut out of a Arbockel's coffee tin under the bottom pin. That she laughed once. Just once that anybody heard. At Teague. He'd gone to lift a sack of feed off the wagon, and he'd got old for 1 second. His back caught and he made a sound and had to stand there with his hands on the tailgate. And Mendez said she laughed. One short hard breath of a laugh. And Teague straightened up and looked at her, and Mendez swore on his mother that Holly's Teague, who had not smiled in the memory of any man in Cordero Wash, smiled. And here's the one I've kept for last, because I promised you. The 2 syllables. What she said to me over the tailgate in the dark when I gave her the string. Mendez had it out of her eventually. Mendez had 30 words of Apache from a lifetime of horses and border and stubbornness, and he pieced it together over a couple weeks, and came and told me in my shop with his hat in his hands like he was delivering news of a death. She'd said not enough. 2 syllables. Looking at my string, at my 9 3/8, at the whole apparatus of a man being kind at a distance of 6 feet with a piece of string. Not enough. She was right. God knows she was right, and I've carried it 30 years, and the awful part, the part I'd take back before I'd take back the crowd or the notice or the nails, is that I thought she meant the boots. I thought she was insulting my work. I actually went home that night a little sore about it. Krell had a way of standing that I've only seen in men who have been paid by the head. Weight on the back foot, hands loose, head tipped just slightly, like whatever you were saying was interesting and also not going to matter. He was maybe 50, gray in the mustache, clean, that's what got me. How clean he was, in a town where the mud came up to your knees. He had boots you could see the street in, and he listened to Purcell talk for 11 straight minutes without once interrupting him. I know it was 11 minutes because I timed it. I stood in my doorway with my watch open in my palm, and I timed it, the way I'd time a horse's wind, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and I have never in my life known what to do with my hands. 11 minutes. Purcell talking, gesturing, working himself up, doing the whole performance, and Krell nodding along, patient as a priest. Then Krell said about 4 words. And Purcell went the color of a dead man. That's what I saw from 60 feet. Purcell's mouth stopped, and his hands came down off the air and hung by his sides, and he took a step back, and Krell put one finger, against Purcell's chest, and left it there and said something else. Purcell nodded, fast, 6 or 7 times the way a man nods when he's not agreeing, he's just trying to make the finger go away. Then Krell walked back into the Rialto, and Purcell stood in the street for a long time by himself. I closed my watch. I want to tell you I went over and asked him what was said. I didn't. I went inside and I finished a cinch ring and I hummed, and the tune was, "Shall We Gather at the River?" And I have not been able to hear that hymn since without wanting to put my fist through something. It was Mendez who found out. It's always Mendez. Krell had told Purcell, then you shouldn't have sold her. And then with the finger, now she costs money. You have to understand what I understood then, which was nothing, and what I understand now, which is most of it. By that fall the money had gone strange. The open bounty was a dead thing, officially. The territory had gotten shy about it. The papers back east had gotten interested. And there were men in Prescott who very much wanted the whole arrangement to have never existed. But dead things out there didn't lie down. They just moved into the back rooms. There was still money, it just wasn't for scalps anymore. It was for people, specific people, names on lists that came down from somewhere and got handed to men like Krell in the back of hotels, and the men like Krell went out and collected, and the collecting had a paper attached to it now, which made everybody comfortable. Vagrancy, contracts of service, removal to a reservation, which was a word people said the way you'd say hospital about a place that was not a hospital. There'd been a fight in the Chiricahuas in July. Bad one. Not a battle, a camp at dawn, and the word for what happened isn't battle. Afterward, the count didn't come out right. Somebody's ledger said 41 and somebody's field report said 38, and 3 people were unaccounted for. And in that country in that year, unaccounted for was a hole in a man's career. She was one of the 3. I didn't know that in October. Nobody in Cordero Wash knew that in October. Purcell hadn't known it. Purcell had picked her up off a wash 40 miles south, half dead, and thought he'd found groceries. Krell knew it. Krell had ridden 500 miles with a name in his pocket. And here's the ugly beautiful joke of the whole thing. The joke I've laughed at exactly once, alone, at 3 in the morning about 20 years later. The auction saved her. If Purcell had done it quiet, if he'd sold her out the back of a barn to a man with a wagon, she'd have gone south, and no one would ever have written a word down. But Purcell was vain. Purcell wanted a crowd. Purcell nailed a notice to the freight office wall in my own lettering, and that notice went into the freight office ledger as a public sale, and the public sale went into the Cordero Wash Sentinel in 6 lines of agate type on the back page, and the Sentinel went out on the Tuesday coach. Which is how Krell found her. And also, and I need you to hold both of these at once, because I've had 30 years and I still can't hold them steady. It is how, 4 months later, a lawyer in Tucson found her too. But that's the end. I'm getting ahead. Teague didn't come to town that Saturday. That was the first thing that was wrong, and I noticed it the way you notice a clock that stopped. Not right away and then all at once, and then you can't hear anything else. Saturday came. No Crossgay wagon. Coyle's porch had 4 men on it who had nothing to do but count wagons, and they counted 0. And by 2 in the afternoon the whole street knew, and by 3 Krell and his 3 had ridden out south, unhurried, the way men ride when they know the road and the road isn't going anywhere. I stood in my shop. I want to describe to you the exact quality of that hour, because if you've never had one you won't believe how long it is. I had a McClellan saddle on the bench that needed the pommel rebuilt. Good work. Honest work. 2 days' pay. I had my all in my hand. And I couldn't set it down. That's the thing. It wasn't that I was struggling toward some noble decision. I was stuck. I had a tool in my hand and a job in front of me, and the whole architecture of my life said, "Do the job, Tom. You're a harness man. You mend things. Nobody ever asked you to be anything else, and you have never once in 31 years volunteered." At 4 o'clock I put the awl down. At 4:15 I picked it up again. At 4:40 I went out back and threw up into the ash pit, and then I saddled my horse. I'm not proud of the vomiting. I'm telling you anyway. There's a version of this story where a man makes a decision and rides out with his jaw set, and that man is a liar. What actually happens is your body decides about 40 minutes before your head does, and your head spends those 40 minutes composing arguments to a jury that's already gone home. Mendez was in the livery. He watched me cinch up. "Tomás, don't. You have a gun." "No." He went into the tack room and came out with a shotgun that had been hanging on a nail since Grant was president, and he held it out, and I looked at it, and I said the truest sentence of my whole life up to that point. "Mendez, I'd shoot myself with it." He thought about that. Then he nodded, and he put the shotgun back, and he went and got me a canteen and a sack of jerked beef and about 6 feet of good manila rope, because Mendez had known me for 11 years and knew exactly what I was. "Then take what you're good for," he said. I rode out at 5 with a canteen, some beef, a coil of rope, and a full set of harness tools in a roll behind the cantle. 22 miles, dark by 6:30. I got there at 11. The Crossgay wasn't a ranch so much as a rumor with a windmill. Old Kittredge had died in 81, and his sons had gone to San Francisco to be gentlemen, and what was left was 4,000 head scattered over country God had clearly built for something else, and 6 men, and a headquarters that was 3 buildings and a corral, sitting in a bowl of hills with 1 road in. There was a light in the bunkhouse. There was no light anywhere else. I came in slow and made noise on purpose, saying, actually badly, "Old Dan Tucker," which is a hell of a thing to be doing at 11 at night in the dark. But I'd rather be laughed at than shot, and I've never once regretted that preference. And about 100 yards out a voice said, from somewhere I could not locate at all, "Ward. Teague. You alone?" "Yeah." A long pause, long enough for me to understand that he was deciding, and that I had no part in the deciding. "Come on in, then." He was sitting on the ground with his back against a cottonwood about 20 feet off the road, and he'd been there long enough that his shape had gone into the shape of the tree, rifle across his knees. He didn't get up. "They came," I said. "4 of them. They're gone." "They'll be back Tuesday," Teague said. "Man named Krell left a paper." "What kind of paper?" "The kind that's real." He said it flat. "That's the trouble with it, Ward. It's real. Got a stamp and a signature and a clerk's number. Says she's to be conveyed to the agency at San Carlos for her own protection, and it says the party holding her under contract is to render her up on demand. And the demand is Tuesday, and it's signed by a man in Prescott whose name I know because I mended his fence one time for $2 a day." I stood there in the dark. "So don't render her." Teague laughed. I'd never heard it. I'd never heard the man laugh, and it wasn't a laugh. It was a sound a rusty gate makes, and it went through me like cold water. "Ward," he said, "I'm a hired man. I don't own this dirt. I don't own that bunkhouse. I own a horse, a saddle, a rifle, and a bill of sale for a human being, and you want to know the funny part. The bill of sale's the only piece of property I've got that anybody in the territory would go to court over." He was quiet a second. "They're not going to fight me," he said. "That's what you don't understand yet. Krell's not going to fight me. He's going to go get a judge." She was in the cook shack. Not sleeping. Sitting at the table with a lamp turned down to a bead, and in front of her, I want to get this exactly right, because it's the picture I have when I close my eyes and it's the picture I'll have at the end. In front of her was a Winchester, broken down to the last piece, laid out on a flour sack in perfect order. She was cleaning it. She looked up when I came in and her hands didn't stop. She kept running the patch through the bore, slow, even, and she looked at me over the top of the lamp for about 4 seconds, and then she went back to the barrel, and that was the whole greeting. I sat down across from her, because standing seemed worse. "Ma'am," I said. "Nothing. They'll be back Tuesday." Nothing patch rod turn. And I sat there in a cook shack 22 miles from my own bed, at midnight, with a woman I'd helped sell, and I said the thing I'd been carrying for 3 weeks and hadn't been able to put down. "I wrote the notice," I said. Her hand stopped. "The paper on the wall, the one that brought them. I lettered it. He paid me in horseshoe nails and I took them and I used them, and there's a hinge on Coyle's back door hanging on 3 of them right now." The lamp did whatever lamps do. Something popped out in the dark that was probably a horse and sounded like the end of the world. She set the rod down. Then she said, in English, in clear, flat, unaccented English, in a voice I had never heard and had assumed did not exist, "I know. I want to describe what that did to me, but I don't have the equipment." "You," I said. "My father was a scout for the Army for 9 years, she said, "at Bowie. I was raised in a tent 40 feet from the sutler's store." She picked up the receiver and turned it over in the light. "I have spoken English since I was 4 years old. I read your newspaper. I read the 6 lines it printed about me. It spelled Apache wrong." I put my face in my hands. "I'm not going to dress that up." I put my face in my hands at that table, and I made a sound, and it was not dignified. And she let me do it. And when I got done, she was still cleaning the rifle, because the rifle was going to need cleaning whether Tom Ward had a moment or not. "Why," I said, my voice came out ruined, 3 weeks, why didn't you say anything to anybody to him? And she looked at me with an expression I finally had a name for, because I'd seen it on my own face in a mirror at 4:40 that afternoon, throwing up in an ash pit. "Mr. Ward," she said, "in your town I was a thing that could be bought for $2. What do you think happens to a thing that turns out to also talk?" Her name was Dotest. Not the famous one. I've had to explain that to people for 30 years, and I'm tired of explaining it, and I'll explain it once more. It's a name like Mary is a name, and there was more than one, and the one you've read about in books is not the one who was sitting at that table. She told me over about 2 hours, and she told me in the order she wanted, and she stopped when she wanted, and twice she just stopped for a long time and cleaned the same piece over again, and I learned to shut up and let her. The brass button on the rawhide string was her father's, off his scout's coat. He'd been killed in July by soldiers who were in a hurry and did not check, and the last thing he'd done was tell her to go up, because everyone else went down the wash, and going down the wash was reasonable, and going down the wash was how you died that morning. She'd gone up. She'd been the only one who went up. That's the part that broke her, not the killing. She'd told it to me in a voice you'd use for a fence line. But when she got to I was the only one who went up, her hand stopped for the second time and stayed stopped, and she looked at the lamp and she said, He knew that if he told everyone, everyone would argue, so he told one. She cut her hair for 41 people. She'd walked 11 days. Purcell had found her at a seep drinking out of a hoofprint. "And him," I said finally, "Teague." She was quiet. "He hasn't asked me a single question," she said. "In 3 weeks. In 3 weeks." She set the last piece down. "Do you know how loud that is, Mr. Ward? Everyone asks. The one who took me asked. The soldiers ask. You came in here and inside of 1 minute you were telling me about your paper and your nails, and that is a question too, you understand. That is you asking me to say it's all right, Mr. Ward, and I am not going to say it." I nodded. It was all I had. "He doesn't ask," she said. "He says good morning. He asks if he may feed the horses." He built a bar on the inside of a door and put my hand on it and walked away. She started putting the rifle back together, and she did it in the dark, by feel, faster than I could have done it in daylight. For 3 weeks that man has been standing at a distance of 10 feet doing the only thing anybody in this territory has done for me since July, which is nothing. He has done nothing at me on purpose, every day, and it has cost him everything, and he thinks I do not see the cost. "What's it cost him?" She snapped the receiver home. "He owns me," she said. "There is a paper in a box under his bunk." She looked up. "Every morning he gets up and does not use it. That is not nothing, Mr. Ward. That is a man holding a door shut with his back for 3 weeks. And he cannot ever put it down, because the day he burns that paper, I belong to whoever picks me up next, and the next man will not sleep in the dirt." I found him at first light, standing at the corral fence with coffee he wasn't drinking. "She talks," I said. "I know." I stared at him. "You know." "Second day," Teague said. "He watched the horses. She told me to move a horse off a stone bruise in English, plain as you." "Then why in God's name have you been?" "Because she told me," he said, "and she didn't tell anybody else, and that's hers." He drank some coffee. "It ain't mine to spend, Ward. Nothing about her is mine to spend. That's the whole entire deal I made with myself on that dock, and I've kept it for 22 days, and I'll keep it Tuesday." The sun came up over the rim of that bowl and turned everything the color of a peach, and I hated it for being beautiful. "What happens Tuesday?" I said. "Holly's Teague set his cup on the fence post." "Tuesday," he said, "a man with a legal paper is going to ask me to hand her over, and I'm going to say no. And then he's going to go to Prescott and come back in 6 weeks with a marshal and a court order, and the marshal will be a decent man doing his job, and I'll say no to him too, and then it's a felony. He turned and looked at me for the first time. You know what I've got to trade, Ward? 6 weeks. That's it. That's the whole estate. 6 weeks between Krell's paper and the marshal's paper. And after that I'm a criminal and she's on a wagon anyway. Then what good is it? None, he said, unless somebody does something with the 6 weeks. And he looked at me. He just looked at me. He didn't ask. He never asked me anything, that man, not once in his whole life. He just stood there at a corral fence at sunup with his coffee going cold and let the silence do it, the same way he'd let a woman decide about a wagon, and I stood in it and felt it close over my head. I'm a harness man, I fix things. I had a canteen, some beef, 6 feet of rope, and a full set of tools. And I had one other thing, which I hadn't thought about in 11 years, and which came up out of the bottom of me right then like a body coming up out of a river. My brother-in-law was a clerk of court in Tucson. The word is consideration. That's what my brother-in-law told me in a hallway in Tucson in November, with a cold coming on and his collar off. I'd ridden 4 days and slept in a hotel that had lice in a cash money way, and I stood in that hallway and said, "Marcus, help me," and he said the word. Consideration. It means money changed hands. It means that under the law of that territory in that year, if you handed a man a coin and he handed you a thing, the two of you had made something the courts could see. The courts couldn't see a woman. The courts couldn't see 41 people in a wash in July, or a brass button on a rawhide string, or a man sleeping in the dirt of a livery aisle with his rifle on his chest and his face to the street. But the courts could see $2. You're telling me, I said, that the sale is the only real thing about her. Marcus took his glasses off and cleaned them on his shirt for a while, and Marcus was not a brave man and never claimed to be, and he'd married my sister and gone bald early, and he counted things for a living. I'm telling you, he said, that a removal order is administrative, it's a policy. And a contract is property, and property is older than policy. And there is not a judge in this territory who's going to let an Indian agent void a bill of sale. Because if an agent can void one man's bill of sale, he can void anybody's, and every rancher between here and the river will burn the courthouse down. He put his glasses back on. Your cowboy doesn't have to prove she's free, Tom. He can't prove that. Nobody can prove that here. He has to prove she's his. I stood in that hallway a long time. That's the worst thing I ever heard, I said. Yes, Marcus said. It's also 6 weeks turning into 6 months, and 6 months is a different country. There's men in this town. There's a fellow named of Halderman who's been waiting 3 years for the right case to put in front of the right judge, and he doesn't have one, because the ones he gets are all feelings and no paper. He looked at me. You're telling me you've got paper? I've got a stamp and a signature and a clerk's number, I said, and 40 witnesses, and 6 lines in the Sentinel. Marcus was quiet. Then he said, "Dear God, the auction," and started walking very fast. They came Tuesday, Krell and 3. I wasn't there. I want that clear. I was in a hallway in Tucson being useful for the first time in my life, and the thing I'm about to tell you I got from Teague in pieces over years, and from Dotest in one sentence, and the sentence was better than the pieces. Teague met them at the road. He didn't fight. He told me he wouldn't, and he didn't. He stood in the road with his rifle in the crook of his arm, muzzle at the dirt, and Krell read him the paper, and Teague said no, and Krell folded the paper up and put it in his coat and said mildly that he'd be back with a marshal, and that Teague was making a poor decision for a woman he'd owned for 3 weeks. And Teague said, "This is the piece I've never gotten past." Teague said, "Yes, sir, it's a poor decision." And then he stood there until they were gone. That's it, that's the whole confrontation. No shots, no speeches. A man agreeing that he was being a fool out loud on a road and not moving. Dotest's sentence about it, which she gave me a year later in a doorway, was this. He was shaking. She'd been watching from the cook's shack window with the Winchester, and she said his hands were shaking so bad on the rifle that she thought he'd drop it, and he stood there for 20 minutes after the dust settled without turning around, and when he finally came in, he had to sit down on the floor. And that, she said, is when I decided. Halderman was 34 and had 1 lung's worth of enthusiasm for 2 lungs' worth of ambition, and he came out to Cordero Wash in December on the coach with a valise and an overcoat nobody needed, and he asked to see the freight office wall. The notice was still nailed there. Nobody'd taken it down. That's the part that gets me. 2 months and not one man in that town had walked over and pulled out 4 nails, because taking it down would have been a statement, and Cordero Wash did not make statements. It made room for things. Halderman read it, my lettering, my hand. He read it about 6 times, and then he laughed a real laugh, delighted, obscene in that street, and he said, "Mr. Ward, this is the most disgusting document I have ever held, and I could kiss it." "Why?" "Because it's specific." He tapped it. "It names her, it names a term, it names a price, it's witnessed, it's public." He folded it into his valise, nails and all. "Do you know what the agency's paper says? It says an Apache female, that's it, that's the whole description. They can't produce a single sheet of paper in this territory that says who she is." He grinned like a wolf. "But we can, because you sold her, and to sell a thing you have to say what it is." I stood in the street and felt the ground move. That's the joke. That's the whole joke, and it took me 30 years to laugh at it, and then only once. The paper that damned her was the only paper that named her. Everything else, the fight in July, the count that didn't come out right, the 3 unaccounted for, all of that lived in a place where she had no name and no shape and could be moved like weather. The only place in the world where Dotest, daughter of a scout out of Bowie, existed as a specific human being with a documented history was a handbill I'd lettered for a sack of horseshoe nails so that men could bid on her. To sell a thing you have to say what it is. The hearing was in March in Tucson, and it took 2 hours and 11 minutes, and it was the worst 2 hours of Holly's Teague's life, and he'd been at Adobe Walls. Because here's what he had to do. He had to stand up in a courtroom, in front of a judge and a reporter from the Citizen and about 60 people, with her sitting right there at the table, and he had to say it. Out loud. He had to say, "She is my property." He had to say it in those words because Halderman was very clear that any softening, any "I look after her," any "she's in my care," put the whole thing back into the country of feelings where they would lose. The judge could not hear a kindness. The judge could only hear a claim. So he said it. I was in the 2nd row. I watched him do it. He stood up in a borrowed coat that was too short in the arm, and he put his hat on the chair behind him, and he said the words, and he did not look at her when he said them, and that was the only mercy available in that room, and he took it. And she sat there, back straight, chin at that angle. In my bad boots, which she had worn for 5 months by then, and worn through at the toe of the left one, the bad seam, my fault, and she'd repaired it herself with a scrap of harness leather and a stitch better than mine. She sat there and let 60 people hear that she was a thing. Halderman had asked her permission. That's the one thing I'll say for Halderman, who was a shark and knew it. He'd sat with her the night before at the boarding house that would take her because Halderman paid double, and he'd laid it out, and he'd said, "I cannot do this unless you agree to be called property in public. I need you to say it, out loud, to me." And she'd said yes. And then she'd gone out into the yard and been sick, and Teague had stood at the far end of the yard with his back turned for an hour and a half, at a distance of about 40 feet, doing nothing at her, on purpose, the way he'd done for 5 months. That was their whole courtship, if you want to call it that. I don't know what to call it. The judge ruled from the bench. He was a fat, gray, unhappy man named Prout, who I am told drank, and who I am also told wept at his daughter's wedding, and he ruled in about 90 seconds, and his ruling was, in substance. The contract was valid. Consideration had passed. The agency had produced no instrument identifying the subject of the removal order with sufficient particularity to overcome a documented private claim. The removal order was stayed as to the person named in the Cordero Wash instrument, pending. And there was a pending. There's always a pending. It was pending an appeal that took 4 years, and by the time it was decided, the world had turned over twice, and nobody could find the file. He hit the block with his hand instead of a gavel. I remember that. He'd lost his gavel. And it was over. Nobody cheered. There was nothing to cheer. A man had proved he owned a woman, and a woman had let him, and everybody walked out into the March sunshine of Tucson, Arizona, and stood around not looking at each other. Purcell. I said in the beginning that one of them died of being wrong, and I owe you that. Purcell never got over it. He had it figured that he'd been cheated, and understand, in his own arithmetic he had been. He'd had a $500 name in his hands and sold it for $2 to a cowboy because he was too vain to do it quiet and too stupid to know what he had. Krell had said 4 words to him in the street, and those 4 words had followed Purcell around for the rest of his life like a dog. Then you shouldn't have sold her. He filed a suit. Did you know that? He filed a suit in the fall of the next year to void the contract for misrepresentation as to the identity of the party, and if he'd won it, the sale unwinds and the stay collapses, and she goes on a wagon. Purcell would have burned that whole thing down for $200 and a chance to tell somebody he'd been right. It never got heard. He couldn't pay the filing. He drank at the Rialto for 6 more years and told the story to anybody who'd sit still, and the story got better every year, and by the end of it, he'd been the one who'd found her, and the cowboy had tricked him, and there'd been a conspiracy, and men bought him whiskey to hear it because it was funny. He drowned in August of '93. In Cordero Wash, the actual wash, the arroyo the town's named for, which is dry 360 days a year. He'd gone out into it drunk during a monsoon, and they found him a half-mile down with about 3 inches of water still moving over him. I helped carry him. Somebody had to. I don't have anything clever to say about that. It's just what happened. A man was wrong about something in 1887, and he could not put it down, and it took him 6 years to die of it, and the water that killed him was gone by suppertime. Outside the courthouse on the steps, in the sun, Holly's Teague took an envelope out of his coat. He'd had it drawn up 2 weeks before. Halderman had done it and had not charged him, and had, in fact, argued with him about it for an hour, because Halderman wanted to wait. Halderman wanted the appeal secured first. Halderman was already seeing the next 4 cases. Teague hadn't waited. He handed her the envelope, and she opened it and read it, and I watched her read it, and her face did not change. And I have never in my life wanted so badly to know what was happening inside another human being. It was a deed, a transfer. It conveyed all right, title, and interest in the contract of service dated October 8, 1887, from Holly's Teague to the party named therein. He'd sold her to herself. That was the only door. There was no manumission in a territory that officially had nothing to manumit. There was no form, no clerk, no stamp, no procedure for this woman is not a thing, because to have that form the territory would have had to admit it had been running a business. But a transfer of contract, that was routine. That was a Tuesday. Men transferred contracts all day long. You could not free her, but you could sell her to a person, and she was a person, and nobody at the clerk's window was going to read past the second line. She looked up. "What is the consideration?" she said. Teague went absolutely still, because he'd walked into this thinking he was giving her something. He'd stood on those steps with his whole heart in an envelope, and she'd looked at the paper for 11 seconds and gone straight to the one word that mattered, the word my brother-in-law had told me in a hallway in November, the word the entire architecture stood on. Consideration. Money has to change hands, otherwise there's no contract. Otherwise it's a gift, and a gift can be voided, and a gift means the giver was ever entitled to give. It doesn't matter, Teague said. It matters. Dodest. What is the price, she said. What am I worth, say the number. And Holly's Teague stood on the courthouse steps in Tucson in the March sunshine, and could not do it. He could say she is my property in a room full of strangers, and he could not say $2 to her face. His jaw worked. Nothing came out. So she said it for him. $2, she said. And she took $2 silver out of her sleeve. She'd had them ready. She'd come with them ready, which means she'd known before she ever got there what she was going to do. And if you don't hear the echo in that I can't help you, and she put them in his hand. He didn't want to close his fingers. I watched him not want to. Take it, she said. I can't. You will take it, she said, or the paper is a gift and I will not be given away twice. He closed his hand. Halderman told me later she'd had those $2 for 4 months. She'd earned them at the boarding house, mending. She'd asked him what the price would have to be, back in November before anybody had drawn anything up, before anybody had told her it was possible, because she'd figured it out herself, sitting in a cook shack with a rifle in pieces, the same way I'd figured it out in a hallway, and she'd started saving that same week. 4 months at a boarding house, mending. Not enough, she'd said to me over a tailgate, looking at my string. I thought she meant the boots. I thought she was insulting my work, and I went home a little sore about it, and it took me 30 years to understand that she wasn't talking about the boots at all, or about me, or about 6 feet of distance and a piece of string. She was talking about $2. She'd heard the number that afternoon. She'd stood on a dock and heard 40 men agree on what she came to, and she'd been correcting the figure ever since, all the way through, in every single thing she did, the door hinge, the shims out of a coffee tin, the stitch in my bad seam, the 4 months of mending, and none of us noticed, because we were all so busy being moved. She wasn't asking to be treated like a queen. She was doing her own accounting. She always had been. And when the time came, she walked up and paid the price the world had set on her, in silver, into the hand of the only man who'd ever set it. And she took her paper and she folded it, and she put it inside her shirt against her skin. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Teague." Mr. He heard it, I saw him hear it. He'd said ma'am on a loading dock in front of 40 men, and it had taken her 5 months and a courtroom and $2 to hand it back. And he stood there on those steps with her money in his fist and his hat in his other hand, and he looked about 19 years old. They went back to the Crossgay. I know that much. I know she stayed through the summer, and I know she was gone by the next spring, and I know Teague didn't follow, and I know he never said one word about it to me or anybody ever, and I know he kept the $2 because I saw them once, in '99, in a tin on a shelf in a lined shack, and I didn't ask and he didn't offer. I've heard she went to the White Mountains. I've heard she went to Mexico. I've heard she taught school somewhere, which I like, and I've heard she died in the influenza, which I don't, and I've never chased any of it down. Because I know why she went. I've known the whole time. She had a paper in her shirt that said she belonged to herself, and it was worth exactly as much as the man standing next to her. And the day she stopped standing next to him, it would be worth what any paper's worth in a country that hadn't decided yet. She went to find out. That's not an ending. I know it's not. People want an ending. They want her to have stayed, or him to have gone, or somebody to have said the thing out loud on a porch at sunset. I've had 40 years of people wanting that from me, and I have never once been able to give it, and I've stopped apologizing. I've got the boots. She left them, on the step of the cook shack, side by side, toes out, the way you leave a thing on purpose. The left one still has my bad seam in it, with her stitch over the top of mine and hers held. I've had them on my shelf since 1888. I look at them most days. I've never been able to figure out whether she left them because she'd outgrown them or because she was telling me something, and I've picked them up 100 times to see, and there's nothing in them, and there never was, and I keep